Welcome to the pulsating biology, and we were covering the chapter respiration for Olevels biology. We have already covered several topics, but in this video we are going to cover the topic for the aerobic and the anaerobic respiration. First, let's learn what is meant by the term aerobic and anaerobic. When we talk about the aerobic, it all kinds of the reaction in which oxygen is involved is termed as the aerobic, and in the one that in which oxygen is absent, we say are termed as the anaerobic reactions. Now, let's talk about the difference between both of them in a much more detail. When you talk about the reactants that are included in the aerobic reactions, we say is the glucose and the oxygen, since it includes the oxygen in it. And when you talk about the anaerobic, we say that the oxygen is absent, therefore there is only presence of the glucose. When you talk about the combustion reactions that are related to the aerobic one, combustion mean any reaction that includes or with the liberation of oxygen in it. So whenever any reactions include oxygen as its reactant, it is termed as those as the combustion reactions. Alright, so the relation between the combustion and aerobic reaction is that mostly the aerobic reactions or the anaerobic reactions has a complete and an incomplete. When you talk about the aerobic, it has complete combustion reaction, while when you talk about the anaerobic, it has incomplete combustion reaction due to absence of oxygen. When you talk about the energy yield that is in the aerobic reaction is almost very high, that is near to 36 to 38 ATP. ATP are the adenosine triphosphate that are the energy molecules that are released any sort of the reaction. As related to the anaerobic reactions, we say it has a low ATP release, that is almost 2. That's the energy yield in the anaerobic reactions are always lesser than the aerobic reactions. Let's move forward. When you talk about the products that are released in the aerobic reactions, we say that these are mostly carbon dioxide and water. But when you talk about the anaerobic reactions, we say there are two kinds of the product that are formed. One is the lactic acid, that is termed as the lactic acid anaerobic reaction, and the other is the ethanol and the carbon dioxide, that is termed as the alcoholic fermentation. So these are the two kinds of the products that are formed in the anaerobic, and in the aerobic we say the carbon dioxide and water are basically formed. Where does the aerobic reaction takes place? That's a very important question that often comes in your exam, that the region where the location of the aerobic reaction is termed as the cytoplasm and also mitochondria. But when you talk about the anaerobic reactions, we say they are mostly taking place only in the region of cytoplasm. At the last, we need to learn what are the stages that which the aerobic reaction goes through and the anaerobic reaction goes through. So the stages of the aerobic reactions are basically 4 of them. The one is the glycolysis, in which the end product is the pyruvic acid. Then we say is the link reaction, or it is also known as the electron chain reaction. Then we say is the Krebs cycle, and then we say is the electron transport chain. But when you talk about the anaerobic reactions, we say that the anaerobic reactions are most to the two kinds of the stages. One is the glycolysis and other is the fermentation. These are the basic differences that you need to learn for your exams in the aerobic and the anaerobic reactions. Now let's talk about the lactic acid and its accumulation in the body. Whenever you talk about the lactic acid and its accumulation, you need to understand one pointer, that it is due to, or the major reason for the lactic acid accumulation is due to the vigorous exercise. Whenever an athlete or any human being that is basically going through a vigorous exercise or performing any heavy activity, we say that due to the vigorous exercise, there's always a supply of oxygen being a limiting factor. When you talk about oxygen, it is a limiting factor. So we say whenever oxygen is being the limiting factor, that means whenever a person is performing vigorous exercise, the muscles require more amount of the oxygen to cope up with that. However, limiting factor terms as a factor that is required in a very large quantity but can also cause a death in that condition. So oxygen is that factor, and therefore we say that the demand of that limiting factor is always increased whenever the heavy exercise is being performed. And in such a manner, what actually happens is that glucose combines with oxygen and gives us almost 38 amount of ATP. And whenever there is no oxygen or there is an absence of oxygen, whenever we say there is an absence of oxygen, we term it as an anaerobic respiration. And in such an anaerobic respiration, we say the ATP that are generated are almost only 2. So the 2 ATP are generated in the absence of an oxygen, and 38 ATP are generated in the presence of oxygen. So the person is able to basically run a sprint of like 100-meter sprint or even more than that whenever there is a lactic acid fermentation, oxygen being the limiting factor, and whenever there's the demand of oxygen is much more than the casual one. Now let's talk about what happens after the exercise. So the lactic acid builds up in the muscle cell. When you talk about the lactic acid, it basically builds up in the muscle cells. Builds up in the muscle cell. And what does it do being built up? It diffuses into the blood. It diffuses into the bloodline and it is taken into the liver. From the blood where it is diffused, this is taken into the liver and then converted back to its original condition, that is termed as the pyruvate, or you can also term is at the glucose. So it is absorbed into the blood and is taken into the liver where it is converted into its original form, that is the pyruvate, or you can say as the glucose, and the respired oxygen that is to be released have more amount of the energy than the anaerobic one. And this is such requirement that is basically that a muscle require in order to perform more efficiently whenever it is going in a depth of oxygen, because the vigorous exercise causes the muscle to perform more, and for that it requires more amount of the oxygen. And in order to intake more amount of oxygen, what the person do is that he breathes deeper. So the deeper breathing is a phenomena or the factor that allows more amount of the oxygen to basically enter and protect the body from the oxygen depth. And in such a condition, we say that basically the condition is the EPOC. That means excessive post-exercise oxygen consumption. This is what the EPOC stands for. On or another level, you can also term as the oxygen depth. The oxygen depth is basically a condition in which the oxygen is basically in a very less quantity and is required more by the muscle, and we say that the faster heart rate continues in that in order to cope up with the muscle functioning. So in such condition, the deep breathing helps us cope up with that mechanism and supply the extra oxygen needed to break down the lactic acid. This is the entire phenomena that you need to learn, that what happens whenever a person is performing a vigorous exercise, what is the post effect of the vigorous exercise, what happens after that, and what happens if the muscle undergoes the oxygen depth. So the cope of the oxygen depth, we have learned that the person needs to perform the deep breathing in order to supply the extra oxygen needed to break down the lactic acid. There we are done with the chapter. If you have any confusion, you can ask in the comment section below. Thank you for watching.